Hello and welcome to another episode of Study Sessions. My name, of course, is Mr. Boff. Now, this is for Year 10. We're looking at Paper 1, English Literature, the Shakespeare Macbeth question. This is your half-term homework. You're completing the paper, looking at, of course, The Christmas Carol and looking at Macbeth. And this is focusing on the Macbeth task. And the Macbeth task is actually all about Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth as a character who changes. So the purpose of this episode is to give you really an argument and I think more broadly a framework for thinking about the change that Lady Macbeth undergoes over the course of the play. Because Lady Macbeth is not some sort of fixed symbol of cruelty. She is a character, as I will argue in today's episode, and this is the argument that we would like to see in your responses too. She is a character who changes in a very profound and, in fact, tragic way across the course of Macbeth. Now, one way of understanding this change is through the idea of affect. A-F-F-E-C-T. Affect. Now, when literary critics use the word affect, they're not simply talking about emotion in a general sense. Affect refers, and you need to pay attention, this is really key. Affect refers to the capacity to feel, that is, the ability to experience feelings like remorse, guilt, pity, fear, or moral disturbance. It is the emotional responsiveness that makes a character, makes a person fully human. Now, if we trace Lady Macbeth's journey very carefully, we can see that at the beginning of the play, she actually attempts to eliminate, remove entirely, affect from herself. By the end of the play, affect returns with a vengeance, and actually overwhelms her. Lady Macbeth's tragedy then lies in that reversal of affect. Eliminated, or she attempts to eliminate it at the start of the play, and it returns by the end. So let's start at the beginning, Act 1, and that attempt by Lady Macbeth to remove affect. So when Lady Macbeth first appears in the play, she is in many ways defined by control. After reading Macbeth's letter, she immediately identifies what she sees as his weakness, and she voices these concerns aloud in a famous soliloquy. Yet I do fear thy nature, it is too full of the milk of human kindness. Now that phrase, milk of human kindness, is significant. Milk suggests it is associated with nurture, with softness, even maternal instincts. Lady Macbeth views this emotional sensitivity that she detects in her husband Macbeth, she views that emotional sensitivity as a flaw. For her, kindness isn't a virtue, it's not a good or positive quality, it is an obstacle to be overcome. And this then leads directly into her very famous invocation. Quote, "Come, you spirits, unsex me here and fill me from the crown to the toe top full of direst cruelty." Now, here she doesn't merely ask for courage. This is important. She asks to be transformed. She imagines her body as something that can be emptied and refilled, emptied of softness and filled with cruelty. I think the most revealing line, however, is this: stop up the access and passage to remorse. Remorse is imagined, depicted in that line, as something that travels through the body, something that can enter and circulate within us. Lady Macbeth asks for the channels of emotional response to be blocked, to be stopped up. So, in other words, she tries to remove her capacity for guilt. So, when she then says, "Make thick my blood," this is a continuation of the same idea. In Shakespeare's time, blood was commonly associated with emotion and vitality. So, to make blood thick is to slow circulation, or, in other words, to harden oneself against feeling. At this early stage, Lady Macbeth seems to equate strength with the absence of affect, the absence of our emotional capacity to feel. She believes that to act decisively, or as she says, to catch the nearest way, she must first silence, even eliminate her emotional responsiveness. Okay, now we're going to move ahead to after the murder and that idea of controlled suppression. After Duncan's murder, Lady Macbeth appears composed while Macbeth falters. She insists, "A little water clears us of this deed." How relaxed, almost sort of blithe in its relaxed nonchalance that line feels when we read it aloud. And the simplicity of this statement is striking. She is here reducing regicide to a physical stain, that is, the literal blood on her hands, that can be washed away. She deliberately refuses to acknowledge any deeper psychological consequences. However, Shakespeare signals that this control that she seems to be demonstrating is not without effort, it's not effortless. When she warns Macbeth, quote, "These deeds must not be thought after these ways, so it will make us mad," the word mad reveals her awareness of psychological danger. She seems to understand that reflection, rumination, almost excessive consideration and thought on what they've done will lead to madness, will lead to breakdown. Her strategy then is not ignorance, it's the strategy of emotional repression, pushing away those psychologically dangerous thoughts that, if thought about too much, could make them mad. Lady Macbeth is actively holding affect at bay. The emotional consequences of the murder aren't absent, they're suppressed. Okay, I'm thinking in this next section about the gradual return of affect. Because as the play progresses, Lady Macbeth's dominance diminishes. Okay, we know that she's very dominant, full of imperatives, commands at the start of the play, particularly in her interactions, of course, with Macbeth. But it's as the play progresses that dominance starts to fade. And in the banquet scene, she attempts, and indeed fails, to steady Macbeth when he reacts to Banquo's ghost, a ghost, of course, that she herself cannot see. Yet her language feels sharper and more strained. It's as though she's no longer directing events, she's trying to contain and limit damage. When she later says, "You lack the season of all nature's sleep," this is advice she's giving to Macbeth, note how her tone has shifted. Sleep, earlier dismissed as kind of unimportant, now has become central. And we know that sleep is a key motif in the play, as indeed is sleeplessness. Sleep represents innocence and peace, both of which have been disturbed. So from this point onwards, Lady Macbeth actually withdraws from the centre of action significantly. Shakespeare doesn't really show us her gradual decline. Instead, what he does is he presents it very suddenly in Act 5. And it's in Act 5 that we get the overwhelming return of affect. The sleepwalking scene in Act 5 is the moment where affect returns with full force. The woman who, as we've discussed, who once dismissed guilt, now cries out, "Damn spot." The imagined blood on her hands cannot, as she seemed to believe at the start of the play, now it cannot be washed away. The word damned, we would zoom in any exam on that particular word because it indicates moral and spiritual awareness. She recognizes the full moral weight of what she has done. She is damned. Okay, she's going to hell. So when she asks, "Will these hands ne'er be clean?" the question is no longer rhetorical or dismissive. It's pathetically desperate. The blood is no longer a practical problem. It is a psychological stain. Her speech fragments into broken phrases. She relives traumatically past moments. Memory invades the present. She cannot control her mind. And this is the crucial transformation. All that emotional capacity or affect she tried to eliminate has returned. And it's returned not gently, but violently. Because it was repressed rather than processed and thought about, it resurfaces uncontrollably. And the doctor observes that more needs she, the divine, than the physician. So her illness is not physical, it is spiritual and psychological. Her mind has turned against her. This is the psychological consequence of guilt and her involvement in Duncan's regicide. So, Lady Macbeth's tragedy then is internal and it is psychological. She doesn't die heroically. She doesn't confront her enemies. Lady Macbeth's death occurs off stage, reported rather than being seen by the audience. And this is, in some ways, very appropriate because her real collapse has already taken place in her mind. At the beginning of the play, Lady Macbeth attempts to redefine strength as a form of emotional numbness, a removal, a loss of affect. She seems to believe she can remove remorse and still somehow remain psychologically intact. But Shakespeare ultimately shows us that this is an impossibility. Affect is not some optional part of humanity. It cannot simply be stopped up, no matter how much we might call upon evil spirits. It can be delayed, it can be temporarily suppressed, but it can't be eliminated. So by the end of the play, Lady Macbeth is no longer that commanding figure who invokes spirits, commanded and in fact emasculates Macbeth. She is reduced to these repetitive gestures of hand washing and fragmented, fractured, and at times incoherent speech. The emotional capacity she tried to silence has returned and returned in excess. So we can put it like this. The tragedy of Lady Macbeth lies not simply in her ambition for herself and her husband Macbeth, but in her failed attempt to escape and move beyond her own humanity. So, in summary, then, final reflections. Lady Macbeth begins by trying to remove affect in order to gain power. She ends overwhelmed by affect, powerless within her own mind. The very emotions she considered weakness prove to be unavoidable. It is in this sense that Shakespeare presents her not merely as a villain, but as a deeply tragic figure, one who has attempted to silence guilt only to be destroyed by its return. Now, as always, I hope you found this episode useful, particularly as it directly links to your half-term homework. I hope there are ideas and analytical points, observations in this episode that you can use and write up in your response for this paper one half-term task. And so, as always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.